My fiance stole $1,000 from our wedding fund for a Tesla. You won't believe how I found out or the drastic step I took next. I met Mike during my sophomore year of college, back when my priorities were a bit different and my worldview hadn't fully solidified. He was a year ahead of me in school, studying computer science with a particular focus on game development, and I was studying finance and economics. At the time, his confidence struck me as refreshing in a sea of undergrads who had barely decided on a major. He knew exactly what he wanted to do: work on video games or develop cutting-edge software, something related to the technology of the future. I found his passion attractive. He seemed driven, full of ideas and creativity, and we quickly formed a bond that felt both comfortable and exciting. We started dating a few months after meeting, and while we disagreed on some things, especially about money and how we each viewed our future, those differences felt trivial at the time. Because both of us were students, we initially lived in campus housing. But once we decided to get more serious, we rented a small off-campus apartment together, near where Mike's family lived, as it seemed practical. The arrangement included a rent discount from Mike's father, who owned a building in the area. It was meant to be a short-term solution, but that short-term solution stretched out longer than expected. I reasoned that it was affordable and convenient. He loved having his dad around for support if anything broke in the apartment. As time passed and our relationship deepened, we continued to cohabitate, steadily blending more of our daily routines and finances. We got engaged relatively early in our relationship, about 2.5 years after we met. The engagement itself wasn't overly formal. In fact, I still recall how casual it all was. We were making dinner in the kitchen together, tossing ingredients into a pot of spaghetti, when out of the blue, Mike asked if I'd marry him. I said yes, more out of excitement for the idea of a future with him than any grand romantic notion. There was no ring involved, at least not then. Neither of us had much money. Eventually, we got simple, inexpensive rings, the sort you might find on the lower end of any jewelry store display. That was more than enough for me, because I've never been much for flashy jewelry or big displays of wealth. I've always been more concerned about stability, about investing in a sound foundation for the future, rather than wearing something that demanded too much attention. By the time we got engaged, I was well into my junior year, and Mike was close to graduation. He ended up taking extra time to finish some courses, life circumstances, a couple of changes to his major, and a desire to add specialized classes meant he was effectively a super senior. Meanwhile, I was finishing early, thanks to accelerated coursework. From the outside, it might have looked like we were on different tracks. Mine, pushing me forward as quickly as possible, and his, meandering but still purposeful in its own way. A major turning point came when we decided to pool our money. Mike's father had suggested that since we were planning a future together, we might as well get used to seeing our finances as a single unit. I took this advice seriously. I'm the type of person who loves financial planning, spreadsheets, budgeting apps, and investment strategies. Excel is almost comforting to me. I genuinely enjoy setting goals, tracking progress, and creating contingency plans. Mike's approach to money was looser. He liked the idea of living in the moment with his finances, not worrying too much about tomorrow's costs or next year's bills. At first, I admired his carefree attitude, but as I became more serious about building a life, I realized I did want him to meet me halfway when it came to fiscal responsibility. Still, I took on the role of money manager for us, with his consent. We sat down together to establish monthly goals. We created multiple funds: an emergency savings account, a retirement savings fund, a future housing fund, a wedding honeymoon fund, and additional categories for everyday expenses: rent, utilities, groceries, a date fund, even a small allocation for our shared pets. We had separate fun money accounts for each of us, designed so neither would need to justify personal indulgences to the other. That part was important because I never wanted him to feel like I was nitpicking his hobbies or telling him how to spend every single dollar. Autonomy was key to me, and I believed it would help us avoid the little resentments that can build up in a relationship if someone feels controlled. Our fun money accounts were set up so that once the main obligations were met, any leftover we agreed upon would get distributed evenly into his and hers. I didn't pry into what he did with his chunk. He loved gaming. He had multiple MMO subscriptions, always bought brand new A releases the moment they hit the digital store, and would indulge in the microtransactions that those games often promoted. I knew his $50 or $100 would typically disappear within a few days after payday, but I never judged him for it. We had that system in place so we could each enjoy ourselves in our own ways, and I figured as long as he was happy and we weren't going into debt, it was fine. Separate from everything else, I had an inheritance. My parents had died when I was younger. It wasn't an astronomical sum, but it was considerable enough, especially once I'd had it invested in some relatively secure mutual funds and bonds. I kept it completely separate from our day-to-day financial dealings. Mike knew about it, but he didn't have access, and we'd always been on the same page about leaving it out of our near-future plans. I explained to him from the start that I wanted to grow and protect that inheritance until I was older, and he didn't seem to mind. Perhaps he thought it was a future windfall we might enjoy. But for now, it was a distant reality. Over time, I'd grown used to Mike's rapid spending habits in his personal fund. It never really became an issue because I budgeted for that. But something changed in him around the time we both were nearing graduation. We'd been engaged for a year and a half, together for a bit over 4 years, and I'd gotten an early job offer in my field. I was excited. It was a good, stable position with benefits and a decent starting salary. Nothing astronomical, but enough to give me confidence that I could save for a down payment on a house within a few years. While I was thrilled, I could sense a change in Mike's demeanor. He'd had interviews, but no offers that he considered good enough. Some were competitive offers for an entry-level software developer, but not to the degree he felt matched his skill set. He wanted more. He wanted, I suspect, a bigger paycheck than mine, or at least something that looked prestigious on paper. His frustration at not having that immediately grew day by day. Our wedding was initially planned to be small and simple, with maybe a $2,000 total budget and an extra $500 to $1,000 for a short honeymoon. I was proud of how we'd managed to keep costs modest. We'd skipped the big floral arrangements, fancy venue, and expensive catering. I even said no to a fancy engagement ring, wanting to put that money into a nicer house someday. My primary concern was building a strong financial foundation for us. It was consistent with the philosophy I'd tried to uphold. Live below your means, especially when you're just starting out. That's how you build wealth and security. Mike had agreed to that, or so I thought. Then one day, about $1,000 simply disappeared from our wedding fund. The bank alerted me to a transfer withdrawal. I was baffled. I remember sitting at my desk in our tiny study area, flipping through statements in confusion. I double and triple checked everything, hoping maybe there was an error or a bank glitch. But it was real. $1,000 was gone. Feeling a swirl of anxiety and the beginnings of anger, I decided to approach him calmly but direct, something I'd been working on, communication without letting my frustrations run wild. I recall the moment vividly. He was in the living room, headphones half off one ear, clicking away at a game, some brand new shooter he'd just downloaded. I said we needed to talk. He must have seen my serious expression, because he turned to me, slightly pausing the game. "What's up?" he asked. I tried to keep my voice level. $1,000 went missing from the wedding fund. Do you know what happened to it? He paused the game fully, set his controller down and sighed. Yeah, I took it. I just stared, waiting for him to elaborate, and he said something that made my stomach drop. I reserved a Tesla Model 3. I felt heat rising in my chest, a mix of shock and anger. But I kept my voice even. So you took the wedding money for a car? He explained that he wanted the Tesla more than anything. It was his dream car, the embodiment of futuristic technology. He'd always talked about being on the cutting edge, about how electric vehicles were the future. And this was a way for him to have something that aligned with his image of success. I deserve something nice, he said. I've been working hard and I'm about to graduate. Why shouldn't I have a nice car? I didn't argue with him at that moment. Instead, I said something like, I'm not thrilled about it, but I don't want to talk right now. I need some time. He asked if I was going to do research because that's what I always did when uncertain about a decision. I just nodded. Yes, I need to think this through. Then I walked away into our study area, closed the door and tried to calm myself. Part of me felt betrayed. We'd talked repeatedly about wanting to keep our costs low, especially right after graduation. We'd planned to move to the city where I'd accepted my job, a place with great public transportation, which meant we wouldn't even need 2 cars if any. Our old beaters could be sold off because the city's train system was comprehensive enough for commutes. We were going to save thousands of dollars a year by not splurging on a new vehicle. Yet, behind my back, he dipped into our wedding fund to put money down on an expensive electric car that we didn't need and honestly couldn't really afford. Not if we wanted to keep up with the rest of our financial goals. In the days following that discovery, the tension in our apartment felt palpable. Mike acted irritated that I wasn't supporting him. He said I made enough money with my upcoming job to float a Tesla anyway, so why couldn't I just let him have his dream car? When I brought up how we'd promised to keep living like frugal students a bit longer so we could afford a house in a better neighborhood, maybe start a family on stable ground, he brushed me off. He claimed I was trying to suppress his happiness. I felt a knot in my stomach. It wasn't like I was forbidding him from ever buying a nice car. I just wanted him to talk to me first. We were, after all, supposed to be partners. One night I came home from class late and found him waiting for me with a determined look on his face. He told me about some job offers he had recently turned down, and how he believed there was a better offer coming. "I'll make more than you, don't worry," he said, as though it were a competition. "I'm not going to settle for less. I deserve better." I tried to reason with him, to point out that an entry-level developer salary might not be exactly what he imagined in his head, but he was adamant. Then he segued into the Tesla situation, telling me that if I truly loved him, I'd support him in fulfilling his dream of owning that car. I remember stating calmly, "I do support your dreams, but this is about timing and communication. You took our wedding money without asking. That's not okay." He got angry. He retorted that he shouldn't have to ask permission to buy a car. "I'm not a child," he said. "I don't need you managing every little thing." We'd never had an argument this intense, and we were both hurting, but neither of us seemed ready to back down. The more he spoke, the more I realized that we had fundamentally different views on money and, possibly, on how to treat each other in a partnership. He accused me of being privileged because I didn't have student loan debt. He saw me as someone who had no idea what debt meant or why it might be a tool to get what you want immediately. I tried to explain I did have loans once, but I'd managed to pay them off through scholarships, side jobs, careful budgeting, and the small inheritance. He insisted that my position in life was just luck, that I couldn't possibly understand the value of leveraging debt for something that made you happy. I remember becoming speechless. It was like we were living in two different worlds, describing finances from entirely separate vantage points. A few nights later, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling while he gamed in the next room. Thoughts swirled through my mind. Did I really want to walk down the aisle feeling this uncertain? Could we reconcile these deep-rooted differences about money, about respect, about each other's values? I was worried that if we couldn't come to some basic understanding now, what would happen when bigger financial challenges or decisions came along, like buying a home, raising children, if we ever decided to have them, or caring for aging family members? That sense of dread, of doubt, grew heavy in my chest. As painful as it was to confront, I started to realize that I might not be able to marry this man. I cared for him, but trust was eroding. So was my sense that we were a team. The next morning, after another round of tense silence and forced politeness, I decided that this couldn't continue. The Tesla fiasco was just the symptom of something deeper. While he was in the kitchen making coffee, I sat down and told him we needed to talk about our relationship, honestly, openly. At first, he shrugged it off, but then I said the words, "I'm calling off the wedding." That got his attention. He put his mug down, staring at me with confusion, maybe a hint of shock, but not as much as I would have expected from someone who'd just heard his fiancé say the wedding was off. I explained as calmly as I could that I didn't see a way forward for us, at least not in a marriage, if we couldn't see eye to eye on how to handle major life decisions. The $1,000 theft from our wedding fund was unforgivable without at least an apology or recognition that it was wrong to do it behind my back. I told him I felt betrayed. I also reiterated that it wasn't about the car itself, it was about the principle. He'd made a unilateral choice that impacted both of us, and he never even tried to consult me. Then, when confronted, he made me out to be the villain for not supporting him. I said I wanted a partner, not an adversary, and not someone who believed that me having any authority over my own money was some kind of oppression. He responded by saying, I shouldn't have to ask permission to buy something as simple and basic as a car. My stomach nodded again at that. This wasn't a $20 t-shirt or a video game subscription. It was a huge financial commitment. A brand new electric car that would require either a big chunk of money up front or a loan that would further tie up our finances for years. Not to mention the high insurance premiums, the cost of installing a charging setup if we eventually moved somewhere that didn't have a public charger, and every other hidden cost that might arise. And we were both still students, or near enough to be considered early in our careers. We had loans, at least he did, and hadn't even established our full-time post-college earning potential yet. He stood there quietly, arms crossed. I remember him finally saying, "Debt isn't always bad. You're acting like you've never had to struggle. I have huge student loans. Another loan for the car isn't going to kill me." I was trying not to cry at this point because it just felt like we weren't speaking the same language. He saw it as normal and acceptable. I saw it as an abandonment of everything we'd carefully planned. It was disrespectful to me, but he didn't perceive it that way. I forced myself to breathe and said, "It's not only about the money. It's about you doing something behind my back. About you telling me you'd stay within our plan, and then going behind that. It's about making decisions together." I paused. Tears threatened. "I don't think you care about my feelings at all." He just shrugged again, and the nonchalance in that gesture shattered something inside me. "Do whatever you want. If you want to leave, leave," he said, and he turned away, heading back to his computer. There wasn't even a protest, a declaration of love, or an apology. In that moment, it became painfully clear that the relationship was already over, as if he'd chosen his pride or the fantasy of the Tesla over me, over us. It still hurt. Despite everything, there had been real love at one point, genuine friendship, and a dream of a future together. Yet the sense of betrayal and neglect I felt was overwhelming. I went to our bedroom, closed the door, and sat on the bed trying to collect myself. I texted my best friend, telling her what happened, and she immediately called me, urging me to come stay at her place. I had classes to finish, but she told me I could at least crash there for a night or two while I figured out my next move. That day, I started packing. My plan was to leave soon. Maybe not that very minute, but quickly enough to create a clean break. There was no point in prolonging the tension. We'd already had a frank discussion. He'd made it clear I was free to go, so I began boxing up my belongings. Textbooks, clothes, the various little keepsakes from my childhood that I'd brought along. While I was quietly organizing my things, I realized most of what was ours was actually individually owned anyway. We hadn't combined everything into one name, apart from the wedding fund. That was the only account with both our names attached. Otherwise, we'd used separate checking accounts and credit cards, with me funneling money into the joint spaces as needed. Since I wasn't on the lease, indeed it was his father's property, and the arrangement was largely informal, I didn't have to go through any typical landlord or subletting procedures. I wanted to be respectful, though, so I called his dad, explained the situation, and apologized for any inconvenience. His father, surprisingly, was empathetic. He told me that I was always welcome, that he admired my dedication and my plans for the future, and that he hoped we could stay in touch even if I was no longer his son's fiancé. His kindness nearly broke me down. I hung up the phone with tears in my eyes. I spent the rest of the day gathering the last of my valuables and putting them into boxes. Mike barely acknowledged me from the living room. He was on his computer with a headset on, talking to friends online about some raid in a fantasy MMO he'd been playing. The familiarity of his voice, the casual laughter he shared with people half a world away, felt eerie. Here we were, unraveling our entire future, and he was more focused on leveling up in a game. I tried to remind myself that this was exactly the reason I needed to go. That apathy, that refusal to handle real-life concerns, this was our reality. I didn't want it to be mine anymore. Later that evening, I called my bank and arranged to close the wedding account. There was only about $1,000 left in it. He'd already withdrawn $1,000 for the Tesla deposit. Rather than fighting him to return it, I decided it wasn't worth the emotional toll. He could keep the $1,000 or figure out how to handle the deposit with Tesla. I wanted no further entanglements. Once the account was closed, I transferred my half of the remainder into my personal savings and gave him the rest. It wasn't exactly fair, but in my heart I was done. At that point, a few $100s didn't matter as much as getting out cleanly. My best friend arrived with her SUV and we loaded up my boxes. She gave Mike a polite nod, but he ignored her, eyes fixed on the screen. After we drove away, I broke down in tears. She pulled over and hugged. I never realized how much relief and sorrow could coexist until that moment. Part of me felt free and relieved, but another part felt raw grief over a life plan I'd just left behind. I could see how my future had drastically changed in a matter of days. When we got to her place, she helped carry my things inside and ushered me to her spare bedroom. She said I could stay as long as I needed, even until I had to relocate for my new job. She asked a million questions. Had I ever seen signs he was so reckless before? Why did I stay as long as I did if he was that disrespectful? I tried to answer honestly, explaining that it wasn't always like this, or at least, I hadn't seen it this clearly. He used to be sweet, supportive, excited about starting our life together. Over time, little things had shifted, but I dismissed them as normal relationship bumps. For instance, there was the time a year ago when we'd fought about him opening an expensive subscription box for tech gadgets. It was $75 a month, which seemed high for random trinkets, especially since we were trying to save. I'd pointed it out, saying maybe a cheaper subscription might be a good compromise, and he exploded at me, accusing me of micromanaging. Eventually, he canceled it, but never forgave me for taking away something he enjoyed. Now, looking back, that moment was an early red flag indicating we had incompatible attitudes toward discretionary spending. But back then, I rationalized it away. Now I realized I shouldn't have. Over the next days and weeks, I let myself grieve. I allowed the sadness to wash over me, then tried to refocus on the positives. I was about to graduate. I had a job lined up. I had an inheritance I could grow or use someday for a down payment on a home of my own, and I was healthy. Yes, I'd lost someone I'd truly loved, but I was no longer trapped in a situation that felt toxic and diminishing. I spoke to Mike's father once more, a brief phone call where he reiterated his support and sadness at how things ended. He said something I'll never forget. "You'll be a success someday, I just know it. And I'll be proud to say I knew you when." It was such a stark contrast to Mike's refusal to even engage with me at the end. In the following weeks, I focused on finishing my classes, preparing for graduation, and apartment hunting in the city where my new job was located. For the first time in my adult life, I was making decisions solely for myself. It felt daunting, but liberating. I toured several apartments via virtual walkthroughs, fell in love with a couple of them that had big windows and small balconies, and debated whether I needed a one-bedroom or a studio. Without Mike, my monthly expenses would be higher. But ironically, it felt more manageable because I knew I was in full control. No one would be draining a shared account unexpectedly. My best friend stood by me the entire time. She never once pushed me to hurry up and leave her place, although I tried not to overstay my welcome. She also helped me do the math on how to best utilize my inheritance to cover any moving costs and security deposits, and maybe even buy some decent furniture for my new home. At one point, she cracked a joke about wanting to send her cousins over to rough up Mike, which was so out of character for her that it made me laugh. That laughter was precisely what I needed in those tense, emotional days. On a Thursday afternoon, about 3 weeks after I'd moved out, I officially canceled the wedding venue reservation, which was only a small deposit. I also called the handful of people I'd given a save-the-date to. It was humbling to explain what happened, but most of them were kind and understanding. A few were quite shocked. Some had never suspected we'd split. Others, to my surprise, said they had quietly wondered if we were truly compatible but never wanted to interfere. I kept expecting a phone call from Mike, maybe to talk things over or at least say goodbye but it never came. I heard from mutual acquaintances that he'd told them we broke up because she thought I wasn't good enough for her, or she stuck up with her money. Hearing that stung, but I had to remind myself that people deal with breakups in different ways. Maybe he needed to rationalize it that way for his own peace of mind. I felt a swirl of emotions whenever I thought about how close we had come to intertwining our lives forever. Even though I'd begun to see the cracks, part of me still wondered if I should have tried harder, if I should have had more patience. Then I'd recall the fact that he took $1,000 from our wedding account without a word of discussion or remorse, and my resolve hardened. We were no longer a team by that point. One day, in a reflective moment, I looked through an old photo album of the two of us. There were pictures from when we'd gone hiking, from a spontaneous trip to a cheap amusement park, from nights spent in the dorm lounge with our friends. I saw the smiles, the genuine happiness, and it felt almost surreal. That was who we'd been. Two people in love, dreaming about the future with no idea how complicated adult life could be. I let myself mourn that loss. Shortly after, I got a call from the HR department at my new job, giving me my official start date and outlining the final steps, orientation, benefits, the whole 9 yards. I felt a stab of excitement. This was the biggest door opening in my life. I could focus on my career, support myself, and hopefully, someday, find a partner who truly respected me and valued communication and trust as much as I did. I deserved that, and so did my future partner, whoever that might be. When it came time to move to the city for my new job, my best friend insisted on driving. We rented a small truck for my possessions, and she followed behind in her SUV. As we pulled onto the highway, I thought back over everything that had happened. My heart felt lighter than it had in months. I realized I was stepping forward, no longer anchored to the chaos of a relationship that had become toxic. That sense of freedom was worth more than any heartbreak, and while I knew it would still hurt sometimes, I also knew the pain wouldn't last forever. In the new city, I found an apartment on a safe, tree-lined street near a public transit stop. True to form, I stuck with my plan and decided not to purchase a new car right away. Instead, I invested in a monthly subway pass and used ride-sharing when I needed to go anywhere that wasn't on the train line. It felt exhilarating to put into practice the same frugal principles I'd wanted us to use as a couple. Part of me felt sadness that Mike and I hadn't implemented that plan together, but I tried to let those regrets go. He would find his own way, or maybe he wouldn't, but that was no longer my responsibility. I received a few messages from some of Mike's family members congratulating me on the new job, which was unexpected but touching. His mother sent me a short note saying she was sorry it hadn't worked out. She wrote, "We'll miss you, but I want you to know you will always have a place in our hearts." Reading that made me burst into tears. I realized I would miss them, maybe more than I'd miss him. Over the years, his parents and siblings had become a stand-in family for me after I lost. They'd included me in holiday celebrations, birthdays, weekend barbecues. They'd brought me into their family traditions and made me feel loved. The knowledge that I would be losing not just him but all of them hit me hard. Still, I thanked his mother and told her I appreciated everything they'd done. I promised to keep in touch. Whether we actually would or not, only time would tell. Work began soon after, and my days quickly filled with new routines, new colleagues, and fresh challenges. It was a good sort of busy, one that made me feel purposeful and excited about my future. I found myself sleeping better, my anxiety abating. I had no illusions that all my personal woes would vanish overnight. But it was comforting to stand on my own 2 feet and realize I was capable of handling life's hurdles. Over a month into my new job, a mutual friend of Mike's and mine reached out. She asked if I'd heard that he'd actually gone through with buying the Tesla, apparently financing it at a pretty significant interest rate. My stomach sank with a mix of pity and frustration. I was sad he might be digging himself into a financial hole, but also it wasn't my place to intervene. She also casually mentioned that he'd been complaining about how expensive the insurance was and how the monthly payments were strangling him. I thanked her for the update, but didn't offer any commentary. That was his journey now. A part of me hoped he'd learn from the experience, but I knew I couldn't be the one to rescue him. Sometimes, late at night, I'd think about how different life would be if he and I were still together, forging ahead with a wedding and a honeymoon. I'd imagine the arguments that would inevitably have come up with bigger purchases. Would it be a house next time? Or some other large financial decision made behind my back? Then I'd think about how alone I'd felt in that relationship toward the end, and I'd be reminded that leaving was the healthiest choice I could have made. I felt a wave of gratitude for my friend, for the strangers online who'd given me advice or shared their own experiences with similar relationships, and for my own instincts, which finally told me to walk away before making a life-altering mistake. Now, having lived through it, I can honestly say I'm in a better place. I can see how easily one can get stuck in a cycle of making excuses for a partner's behavior. When you're in love, or you think you're in love, it's common to justify so many red flags. You think, oh, it's just a rough patch, or he's under stress, or once he gets a better job, he'll calm down. But sometimes, people don't change. Or if they do, it's not on the timeline you need for your own well-being. If there is a fundamental disrespect, it's unlikely to vanish without a lot of introspection and mutual effort. I realized that Mike wasn't willing to do the work, and I was no longer able to carry the entire weight of our relationship alone. I've settled into my new apartment now. It's been decorated with modest yet cozy furniture. I have a small table by a window where I like to sit with my laptop, working on budgeting spreadsheets. Ironically enough, though now they're only for me, I project how much I can save in a year, or 3 years, or 5 years. I daydream about investing in property someday, maybe a condo, or even a small house if I find a location I love. The inheritance remains invested, untouched, and continuing to grow. It's my safety net for the future, or maybe for a dream I haven't even thought of yet. Do I still think about Mike? Yes, from time to time, especially when I see something Tesla-related or hear about a gaming expo. Memories will flash through my mind, recalling the early days of our relationship when everything seemed so easy and bright. But I recognize that my memory is selective. It wants to recall the warm, comforting moments and gloss over the toxic endings. I gently remind myself of the reality of how it ended, and it helps me move on. Even though I feel that Mike was largely at fault for the final blow, I also recognize that we both contributed to the dynamic that formed in our relationship. I was too accommodating for too long, not standing firm on my values sooner. In a way, I enabled some of his behavior. It's a lesson I've taken to heart. In a partnership, it's crucial to communicate boundaries and expectations clearly and hold each other accountable from the start. If I'd done that more consistently, maybe things would have ended sooner, or maybe we would have sought therapy or deeper discussions before reaching the point of no return. Regardless, I'm in a new chapter of my life. There's relief mixed with occasional sadness, but that's part of healing. I'm grateful for the support system I've had. My best friend, her family, and even Mike's father, who was surprisingly understanding. In many ways, I lost Mike but kept the lessons and the growth. I learned exactly what I need from a partner in terms of mutual respect, communication, and shared goals. I learned to trust my gut when it tells me something is fundamentally wrong, no matter how much I want to believe otherwise. Life is steady now. I wake up early, take the train to work, feel proud of the money I'm saving, and come home to a calm environment that is all mine. Sometimes I'll take a walk in the nearby park, enjoying the bustling city around me. I cherish my independence. I've even started dating again, casually for now, going out for coffee or a simple lunch, slowly reintroducing the idea of sharing time with someone. I don't feel rushed to commit, nor do I fear repeating the same mistakes. I have a clearer sense of who I am and what I won't compromise on. If there's one takeaway from all of this, it's that a relationship must be a true partnership. Two people who each have a voice, who respect each other's perspectives, and who make big decisions jointly. Once that's gone, there's little to salvage. I can't say exactly where Mike's journey will lead him. Maybe he'll thrive, maybe he'll struggle, or maybe he'll come to the same realization too late. But it's not my responsibility anymore, and that knowledge is freeing. I'm not naive about the difficulty of losing someone who was once central to my life. There are still pangs of regret, especially about losing the closeness I had with his family. Yet those pangs grow fainter by the day, replaced by optimism for what lies ahead. I know I'll love again, and I'll do so with a wiser, more grounded heart. Today, looking around my cozy living room, I'm filled with a quiet sense of pride and peace. I don't know if everything happens for a reason, but I do know that walking away from that wedding, from Mike's unilateral choice to sabotage our financial future, was the right move for me. I'm building a life where I no longer have to worry about surprise withdrawals from a shared account or arguments about whether I'm supportive enough of lavish, spur-of-the-moment purchases. Instead, I can celebrate each small victory, like paying off a credit card bill or maxing out my retirement contribution, knowing that this is my journey, one that's aligned with my values, and I'm finally content.